Before we get into today's stories, never miss an update by signing up for the Dread Weekly newsletter on dreadsarmy.com. The link is in the description too. Get the latest encounters, trail camera footage, and news in your inbox once a week. Now, let's get to the story. People around here are pretty superstitious. The land is old. These mountains were forged from the depths of the earth when all the continents were one form. Like a giant island alone in the ocean. There's a lot of history in this place. And there are old things that live deep in the mountains that the locals don't like to talk about. People here are superstitious for a reason. I'll admit that most of the time it's just old ghost stories meant to keep kids from venturing too far into the woods. A lot of these stories came from a time that kids would have the freedom to go out and roam the neighborhood all day as long as they were back by dark, where there was nothing much to actually worry about. However, sometimes the scary stories are justified. In some dark parts of the world, there are in fact monsters. My first experience with them was over 35 years ago. I was 9 years old at the time. I lived in a little trailer house on the edge of town with my mom. We lived in the part of town where the city became the country. Luckily, I was able to walk to a few of my friends' houses during the summer. My other way into town was to cut through my neighbor's yard and walk about a mile through the forest. I had to cross a railroad track and then pass by an abandoned church. In those days, the stories around town were that the church was haunted. People said that demons took over and would come up out of the ground at night and cause all kinds of trouble for anyone who dares get too close. They said the demons were so powerful that none of the priests within 100 miles could get rid of them. They even brought an exorcist, and it was said that the exorcist ran out screaming. Of course, those were just stories. The reality was much, much worse. My encounter happened on a summer night in late August. It was nearly dark and I was heading home from my friend's house in town. My mom insisted that if it was dark out to walk home along the road. She didn't want me near the old church. At the time, I didn't know the demon stories and she never said why to avoid the church. But that night, I was running late and didn't want to get in trouble, so I took the path through the woods. I figured I would be fine because I knew the route like the back of my hand. I remember getting into the woods and hearing all the sounds of the night. The wind in the trees, frogs croaking, and crickets chirping. There were lightning bugs lighting up the whole forest in front of me. I thought it looked like a magic forest. It was only a couple of minutes before I reached the church when all of a sudden everything stopped. No frogs. No crickets. The wind died and the air grew stagnant. Even the lightning bugs disappeared. I knew there was something wrong, so I picked up my pace and tried to get out of there quickly. I heard something moving around inside the church. It sounded like it had claws or long nails and it was scraping them on the walls. I didn't want to think of what it could be. I had hoped it was just a raccoon or something like it, but I knew in the bottom of my stomach that it wasn't. Next, I saw eyes peeking out of the window. I turned to run, but something stopped me dead in my tracks. It was my mother calling my name. I heard her voice and it was coming from inside the church. I turned around to look and I heard her call my name again. And then she asked me for help. She wanted me to go into the church. It was my mother's voice, but I knew in my heart it wasn't her. She wouldn't ask me to do that after insisting I didn't come this way. Something was off about it, but at 9 years old I didn't quite grasp what was going on. "Mom?" I called out but received no answer. The noises were still coming from the church though. I could hear whatever it was moving around. A moment passed that felt like a lifetime, and suddenly the door squeaked open. Standing there in the doorway was a pale creature in the shape of a human. It was crouched down on all fours, ghostly white and bald with big yellow eyes. Its skin looked unhealthy and its eyes were sunken. I couldn't see a discernible nose. From a distance, its face almost looked like a naked skull. It looked straight at me and called my name with my mother's voice. I freaked out and ran all the way home. I ran so fast that I couldn't even turn around to see if the thing was chasing me. I never went back near that old church again, and to this day, I don't go outside at night without a flashlight and a knife. And to be honest, I prefer to not be outside at night at all. It took me until my 20s to even talk about my experience to anyone. I was too scared. Scared that people might not believe me but I was even more scared that if I talked about it, I might see another one, as if speaking of them could make them real and bring them to me. Luckily, that proved not to be the case. However, after eventually pestering some of the older folks in my town, I did finally find out what it was. In a way, they are called earth dwellers. Some people say they predate the existence of even the mountains. It has a name, but it cannot be said aloud. If you say it's bad luck, very bad luck. These creatures were probably around when the dinosaurs lived, but in a different form. Not only do they mimic sounds and voices, they mimic form. However, their mimics are never exact. All the stories are the same. All the people who have heard their loved ones calling their name from the woods, they knew something was wrong. Maybe it was the pitch or the inflection of the voice. Whatever it wasn't right, and people can tell. These creatures try to mimic the form of their prey. We see them as ghouls or goblins. It's their attempt at mimicking a human. It's the best they can do. If they were better at their game, I imagine we would be in more trouble. I'm not sure what they would do to someone if they caught them, but I imagine it isn't good. Kind of makes you think that some of the people who go missing in the mountains might have run into one of the creatures. The only thing I can say for certain is, if you're out in the wilds and something feels off or not quite right, get out of there as fast as you can. I live in central Pennsylvania, dead smack in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. If hiking and nature are your things, then this place is a paradise. Otherwise, there isn't much at all going on. I spend a lot of time up in the mountains, as much as possible, really. I don't have a girlfriend or many friends, and my parents moved to Florida a few years ago. So all of my free time is spent hiking, exploring the ridges and trails. I considered myself to be somewhat of an expert on all the nearby hiking trails and thought that there was very little left more me to see and no more surprises to be had. I was dead wrong. On this particular day, I set off early in the morning. I usually only carried a little water and a light lunch. Even being as seasoned as I was, I didn't really want to get caught in the mountains on a cold January night. And so I had planned to be off the trail and back in my car before dark. I spent the first few hours walking one of my typical trails and even ran into a fellow hiker whom I saw often. We walked together for a bit until around noon when she said she had to start heading back. Continuing by myself and eating my sandwich on the go, I eventually came across a small trail leading off from the main one. This did surprise me a little bit. I had been on this trail dozens of times and had never seen this cut off before. It wasn't intentionally cleared. It looked more like a game trail, but definitely a bit wider than you'd expect a deer to make. Thinking what the hell and excited for a new experience, I cut right off the main trail and onto the cutoff. It was a pretty direct trail, almost a straight line with very few twists and turns. The one thing I noticed was the number of broken branches and twigs scattered across the forest floor. Looking up at the overhanging trees, I spotted a few places where branches had obviously broken off. Some were as high as 8 feet off the ground. I didn't think too much of it. Maybe some kids had come up here acting goofy or something. I walked on for about another 20 minutes or so, eventually coming upon a stream running down from the mountain's top. I was intrigued by the stream. I had no idea where it came from and where it ended, so I followed it upstream a bit. Then I found it. I found a cave set back into the side of the mountain. The stream continued just past it and was only about 10 yards away. Caves aren't exactly common here in these parts of the mountains, and seeing this one made my heart leap with excitement. Of course, there was always the possibility that some kind of predator inhabited the cave, and if so, it was most likely a black bear. I decided that the chance to explore something new was just too good of a chance to pass up, so I started walking toward it. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was rancid, like meat had been left out in the sun to spoil for a week. Mix that smell with damp fur and rotted wood, and you have an idea of the aroma I was experiencing. Alarm bells were going off in my head, but I headed in anyway. I used my phone flashlight when I got close and noticed something odd on the walls of the cave. some kind of art which reminded me of cave paintings made by early humans. Except that the figure in the rudimentary painting didn't look anything like a human. The figures were much taller and wider. They were almost twice the size of a normal human. I had no idea what kind of material was used. It was a splotchy red material. I followed the cave deeper. The further I went, the more intense the smell became. I put my sleeve over my nose and mouth, but it didn't do much to help. The cave curved to the right, and as I came around the bend, it widened considerably into a chamber. I was stunned by what I saw. Ornaments is the word that I guess would best describe them, and they were strung up all across the ceiling of the cave. Lengths of vine that were tied together with various animal bones hung down like sick party streamers. More bones were scattered across the floor. Against one of the walls of the cave stood a 5-foot length of wood with a stone tip lashed to the end of it, like a primitive spear. Across the chamber, stretched out on what looked like a bed of leaves, lay a massive, thick-furred creature. I'm not sure how I missed it initially, but it looked like it was sleeping, its chest rising and falling rhythmically. This wasn't a bear, and I wasn't keen to find out what it was, so I began a slow backward retreat to the cave exit, eyes transfixed on the sleeping thing. I only made it a few steps before my head bumped into one of the hanging streams of bone. I barely had even nudged it, but sure enough, it fell to the floor with a clatter. The creature snapped straight upright, yellow eyes glaring in my direction. Without a second thought, I turned and bolted the way I had come. I heard a string of grunts behind me, accompanied by the clattering of the bone decorations. It was after me. I made it out of the cave into the sunlight, the sudden glare momentarily blinding me. Another threatening grunt was behind me, and I was snapped out of it and off running through the forest. I ran for what seemed like a mile, fortunately with no sign of sight of pursuit. I made it back to the trailhead where I parked my car, jumped in, and peeled out with no intention of ever coming back. And I haven't. The first time I saw them, I was just a kid. My imaginary friends is what my mother called them. How else would a parent explain the things I described? I used to play with them in the yard outside my house. They used to call to me from outside my window, luring me out in the night. When they were there, I didn't even need to open the pane. When they were there, I could pass through the glass like it was a layer of water. These things changed it in some way, I guess. Or maybe I was too enamored by another session with my so-called playmates to notice how they pried open the window without ever making a noise. Either way, those nights often unfolded in the same manner. We'd run around in the grass, easily navigating the dark in fits of giggles and chatter. Their voices sounded more like chirping, but they were easy enough for me to understand. One or two of them would always play with me. They would follow me closely and bend down whenever I found something interesting in the grass. Like a pretty stone or a flower or a toy I'd left outside, there were always more around, but the rest of them only ever watched. They stood back a great distance, blinking with their large black eyes. That should have creeped me out, I guess. But I was always having too much fun to think about the other ones. Aside from those strange black eyes and their pallid skin, they felt like kids. Just the same as me. They were my height and my shape, but gray in complexion. I wasn't worried about what they looked like. We always had fun, except for the nights we were caught. You've been caught by your parents before, right? Excitement drains from your veins and your heart pumps you full of guilt. I knew I didn't belong out there. Especially not after everyone had gone to bed. But how could I tell these friends no? I would have felt guilty for a different reason then. At least this way I got to play for a while. But my parents never caught us together. They always found me alone. My friends were quick. They could hide exactly where they stood, disappearing as if a blanket had been thrown over their heads. Imaginary. That's what everyone told me when I explained it all. At least that's what they said until they saw them. One night after my parents had grown particularly fed up with my antics, they decided to keep an especially close eye on me. They left the door open to my bedroom, which is something they never did. Surprisingly, what woke me that night was the sound of the door closing. I heard it slam shut. I thought I was in trouble already and my parents were upset. But when I turned toward my window, I saw the real culprit. One of my friends was there, looking in through the glass. They chirped at me and I knew at once that they had closed the door somehow. They closed it the same way they brought me outside, in some magical way that I couldn't understand at the time. They wanted me to come outside again. This time, I hesitated. I don't know why. Maybe it was the way my friend slammed the door. It was the first time I'd ever felt anything like frustration coming from one of them. Maybe it was the way this particular friend felt a little different. The way it tilted its head when it invited me out felt more like a lure than a request. It felt like a trap this time, like someone was getting ready to pull a prank on me. That was when my mother walked in. The door squeaked open behind me and I watched the creature's eyes go wide. I followed its stare back to the entrance of my room, where I could see the light from the hall coloring my mother's silhouette. She was ghostly white. Her mouth was open, and her eyes seemed distant. She was looking at my friend, but it was as if she was staring past them. It was as if she saw something bigger out there, something greater than anything I could understand. I didn't know if my friend looked different to her, or maybe she couldn't see them clearly in the light. I'm older now. I guess I know what she was feeling. Terrified. Then she screamed. It's the only time I've ever heard my mother truly scream. It was as if her bones were rattling and her heart was in her gut. My father showed up soon after that. He just appeared. I don't know where he was in the house, but he got there quickly. Basically instantly, he yanked my mother back and stepped inside to check on me. He was just in time to see my friend disappear. He must have only caught a glimpse because he blinked a few times and turned toward me. He opened his mouth but didn't say anything. That night, my parents quickly packed a few basics and we drove an hour and slept at my aunt's house. My parents changed their tune about my imaginary friends after that. They insisted that I stop playing with them and that I never engage with them at all. And so I did. And that's when the invites stopped coming. My late night adventures through the fields outside came to an end. I never forgot them though. I never mistook them for a dream. Neither did my parents. I caught them peeking into my room a few times with sweat on their foreheads and a tremble on their lips. Eventually that stopped too. My life went on as normal, and I think eventually my parents were able to forget about my friends. They pushed it somewhere far back in their minds. At least that's what I tell myself because we never talk about them. But all these years later, I haven't forgotten. How could I forget? I told them I couldn't come outside, but that didn't stop my friends from visiting. They could be there without me seeing, remember? Like wearing a cloak of invisibility. And they could pass through my window without making a sound. Sometimes, even now, I hear their chirping and I know that they're still here with me. I'm Lana, a field biologist, and my specialty is the study of nocturnal animals. During one of my research trips in the Pacific Northwest, I came across something that I still have trouble believing. I was in a remote area studying the effects of light pollution on the local bat species. You know, the usual field work, but something was off that night. Even before the encounter, I could sense a shift in the air, a kind of dissonance in the night sounds. It was as if the creatures around me were aware of something that I was yet to perceive. There was a certain anticipation, a palpable tension that made the night feel heavier. In retrospect, it was as though the forest was preparing me for what was to come, a prelude to the strange encounter that would soon unfold. The sounds I was used to, the rustle of the wind in the trees, the chirp of crickets, they were all there. But there was an additional sound, a strange clicking noise, almost like an insect, but deeper, more resonant. This clicking noise, it wasn't just peculiar, it was disruptive. It seemed to slice through the fabric of the night. It had a strange cadence, rhythmical but not uniform, as if following some unknown language of clicks. The effect on the nearby fauna was noticeable. The chirping of the crickets seemed to lower in volume as if they were trying to hide. The bats I was studying appeared to be disoriented, and over time I noticed that their usual flight paths had become erratic and unpredictable. What's more, I noticed the absence of certain sounds, such as the skittering of nocturnal rodents and the occasional rustle of bushes, indicating the movement of larger mammals. It was as if the regular inhabitants of the night had either gone silent or retreated, leaving the stage to this strange newcomer and its dissonant melody. After listening for a bit, I decided to follow the noise. My curiosity was piqued. It wasn't long before I saw it, off in front of me in the underbrush, moving faster than any creature that size has any right to move, was this pale, gaunt figure. It was around 6 feet long and was moving on all fours. Its face was almost human, but the eyes were all wrong. They were large and black and it had no nose. Its mouth was wide open like it was gasping for air. As I observed the creature, the first thing that struck me was its agility. For something that large and seemingly ill-suited for traveling on all fours, it moved perfectly. It navigated the underbrush with swift, precise movements. There was an odd rhythm to its movements, a sort of serpentine flow that seemed almost hypnotic. It moved both above and through the underbrush seemingly at the same time. Its gaunt body was flexible and swift. The creature seemed perfectly at home in its environment. It would stop occasionally, raising its head as if sniffing the air, then change its direction with purpose. All the while it made those strange clicking noises, the rhythm growing more frantic whenever it altered its course. The uncanny blend of human-like features and animalistic behavior was unsettling. It was a strange being that was out of place. And yet, in the moments I observed it, it was a master of its surroundings. It's strange, but I wasn't immediately afraid. More like shocked, I suppose. I deal with wildlife daily, but this was something else. Something beyond my understanding. So I backed away slowly, not wanting to provoke it. In those moments, my thoughts were a whirlwind. As a scientist, I was struck by the incredible discovery. This creature, whatever it was, could challenge our understanding of zoology and perhaps even anthropology. The scientific implications were staggering. At the same time, the primal part of me was acutely aware of the potential danger. I was alone in the wilderness with an unknown entity. This creature was fast, agile, and clearly not a typical inhabitant of these woods. I was in its territory and I didn't know how it would react to my presence. Eventually, survival instinct overpowered my scientific curiosity. I was in uncharted territory and the smart move was to back away slowly to avoid startling the creature. Despite the awe and the adrenaline rush, I knew I had to prioritize my safety. The forest at night is no place for risks, especially when you're face to face with the unknown. After that night, things in the forest were different. The local wildlife behavior totally shifted. It became more skittish, more aware of something being out there. In the weeks following the encounter, I continued my study, but the experience had left its mark. I found myself paying closer attention to the behavior of the local wildlife. The changes were subtle but noticeable. As for me, the memory of the encounter loomed large in my mind, affecting me more than I'd like to admit. My nights in the field were now filled with a sense of apprehension. Every rustle, every unknown sound sent my imagination racing. I tried to find the creature a few more times. Each time I was equipped with a camera, but the creature eluded me. I confided in a few of my peers about the encounter, and their reactions ranged from skepticism to intrigue. But in the end, without any physical evidence, it remained just an incredible story. Despite the unsettling experience, the encounter has given me a renewed sense of purpose. As a scientist, I feel it's now my job to unravel these secrets, even if it means coming face to face with the unfathomable. But that's a risk I'm willing to take. I was a park ranger for over 20 years. During that time, it never ceased to amaze me just how many people would tell me about encounters they had with the paranormal while visiting our public lands. I've also heard from other park rangers across the country. We do talk about these things if we're ever together. They shared their own stories of bizarre creatures that were disturbing and equally distressing. This made me wonder if this was happening everywhere. But I was always logical and scientifically minded, and so I mostly dismissed these sightings as crazy or else the product of imbalanced individuals. But there's always one story that has stuck with me, and that's because somebody died. And it was told to me directly by someone who was there. A father and his daughter were out for a walk in one of our national forests near a pond where ducks would congregate. The man later explained to me that as he was feeding the ducks with his daughter when he heard yelling in the trees, someone was screaming as if being attacked. He looked around frantically trying to identify who or what was causing the commotion, but saw nothing. He decided to run into the trees following the sound to see if he could help. Almost instantly, he came across a body. On the ground lay a man who had been savagely attacked and was covered in blood. It was a terrible sight, and he was grateful he didn't bring his daughter into the woods with him. She had stayed back beside the pond, forbidden to walk anywhere. The man said there was no sign of anyone, but he didn't really look much because all he could think of was his daughter back by the pond. As he ran back to her, he thinks he caught glimpses of creatures that were wolf-like. He said they were staying back but looking at him with crazy red eyes, and that they were deeper in the trees. He ran to his daughter, grabbed her, and ran to safety. He was deeply distressed and agitated when he told me the story, and to this day I haven't forgot it or the look on his face when he told it. It has stayed with me all these years because it was absolutely real, and the most upsetting part of it all being that somebody actually died at the hands of something deep in the woods, something unknown but dangerous and violent. I hope your listeners will believe me and take care of themselves when they are deep in the wilderness. This is not something to take lightly. Believe it from me.